Part 3. Never defeated, but beware the suicide demon. Eden, Ethiopia, and Israel. Chapter 15. On a flight from Addis to Aksum, I handed a book to my traveling partner, Alex, who had plenty of time to examine it. I thought it was compelling. He handed it back to me and rolled his eyes. The book was Eden, the Biblical Garden Discovered in East Africa, by Gert Muller, a German researcher. It pinpoints Ethiopia as the area that the Scripture describes as the Garden of Eden. Many Ethiopians hold this belief. I met Alexander Campbell, or Alex, who was 25 years old, at the one Eastern Orthodox Church in Addis Ababa. I was 20 years into the Orthodox program, but he only had about a year under his belt. He was a former member of the Presbyterian Church in America, a proper fit for someone of Scottish heritage. He has the classic Viking looks, a warrior's build with red hair and beard, and he explained to me early on that his Campbells are directly related to Hamish Campbell, the right-hand man of legendary Scotsman William Wallace. Alex took his heritage seriously, perhaps too seriously, and I was observing with interest how his first trip to Africa might affect his white and proud worldview. He decided he needed a summer trip to observe Africa firsthand, and we kept getting together for coffee and struck up a friendship. He asked if he could go with me to Aksum. I had a sense he might be complicated, but I was glad to have a partner. Muller's thesis for an Ethiopian Eden is built around the second chapter in Genesis, verses 10 through 14, that describes the location, with Ethiopia mentioned in verse 13. Now a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it parted, and became 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison, that it is which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good, and there is Bdellium and the onyx stone. The name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it which compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel, Tigris. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. The fourth river is Euphrates. Genesis 2, verses 10 through 14, King James Version. Alex joined me during an extensive interview with Germa Batu, the Vice Academic Dean of Ethiopia's Keynote Seminary. He runs the academic program as the formal title of dean is held by the Archbishop. We met in a little standalone boardroom next to an outdoor cafe. Germa bought our lunch. We discussed the Eden theory in particular. The River Gihon is accepted by almost all scholars as the Nile. Josephus and others confirm this view. Germa echoed the Ethiopian Church's belief. In the Church's tradition, there is a perspective among the scholars that Eden is around the River Gihon. Why Gihon? It has a biblical foundation. Did you say Evagorian? I asked. River Gihon, Alex whispered. I continued. What about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers mentioned in the same passage? Wouldn't that point instead to a Middle East rather than Ethiopian location? In fact, this theory is the one most commonly held today regarding the location of Eden. One river points to the area of the Nile and Ethiopia, but 2 rivers from the Middle East are named, so 2 is better than 1. 2 rivers by those names today flow through Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. In ancient times, the region was known as Sumer, the land where Nimrod founded Babel, and the area Abraham left to find the Promised Land. Germa provided what sounded like a good answer to my question of whether 2 rivers were better than 1. Unfortunately, I had a difficult time understanding him, which was a bit embarrassing for me. Germa arguably has a better mastery of certain parts of English than I do. He is fluent in several languages compared to my one. They speak English alone in their classrooms. The problem for me was not the English, but the accents. With Ethiopia's eclectic European influences of Portuguese, Italian, French, and British, along with 71 tribal languages, the combination becomes difficult to decipher. But not for Alex. For some reason, he had an ear for such things. I already knew this by the time of our interview, so I turned to Alex. "Did you catch that?" "Yep." "What is he saying?" He explained it to me. I had already apologized to Girma and other Ethiopian friends many times, explaining my admiration for their linguistic acumen and my ugly American shortcomings. He is saying that the names Tigris and Euphrates in Genesis refer to different rivers than what are today called Tigris and Euphrates in the Middle East, Alex explained. So it is the Gihon, the Nile, that matters because Genesis gives a place name, Ethiopia, a geographical location associated with that river. "Ah," I said, "so that becomes the trump card of the 4 rivers mentioned in Genesis because it gives place names that it flows around like Ethiopia and Havilah." "Yep." People name new cities and rivers after old ones. And this concept is key to remember when trying to decipher the codes of the early Genesis chapters. For example, I met a guy the other day in the Bible Belt area of the American Southeast who told me that he was raised in Rome and educated in Athens. Sounds like a sophisticated European type. Actually, he was born and raised in Rome, Georgia, a small city an hour north of Atlanta, and studied at the University of Georgia an hour west of Atlanta in the city of Athens, Georgia. What if someone told you an ancient civilization once existed somewhere between Memphis and Philadelphia? We might all think of some place between those 2 American cities, maybe around West Virginia or Kentucky. In fact, both cities, Philadelphia and Memphis, are names of ancient Egyptian cities. So the information you received was about Egypt, not the land of Appalachia. Girma was explaining to us that the first Tigris and Euphrates rivers were closer to Ethiopia and the Nile than to the land of Abram. Centuries after those rivers were named, the founders of Babylon decided to name their rivers after those 2 rivers back in the old country. Alex was translating well, but he was not buying the theory. The King James Bible uses the word Ethiopia in the Genesis passage we just quoted, but the underlying Hebrew word is Cush. Alex subscribes to an Arabian Cush theory for this verse. In fact, there is indeed a Cush in Arabia, which we will discuss shortly. Alex was starting to enjoy the ancient city of Aksum, with its 2-hour coffee ceremonies served twice a day by beautiful women in traditional, brightly colored dresses. But I had an agenda. I announced that we were going to find a village somewhere in Ethiopia that has worshipped Jesus Christ for 2,000 years, but still has no electricity. I loved this idea. It breaks through the stereotype that enlightenment comes to African cultures only after missionaries bring power and the Protestant religion. No electricity? Then those Africans must still be pitiful pagans. Ethiopia blows that stereotype. And I was fixed on finding the village that would make my point. My inner football coach was driving me. A reluctant Alex consented. Bozian served as our guide as we took a bus out of Aksum for 2 hours to a smaller town with the plan to travel even further to find our unplugged village. Yurga and Bozian had talked and settled on the perfect community that met my criteria. There were less out there than I realized. On the way, I learned more about Alex's background. He was maybe a little more radical than I thought. I was alt-right, he told me, which is a huge term that covers everything from Nietzschean atheists to traditional Christians just worried about multiculturalism. I listened to my podcasts, I read books, I came at it from a very Calvinist worldview. My particular niche was called kinism. I looked up kinism. Wikipedia's first sentence is as follows. Kinism is a white supremacist interpretation of Christianity. Alex said he wasn't that radical. Kinism raises people's ire, but it wasn't anything like National Socialism or something more extreme, which I never approved of. I sort of sympathized with some of the grander meta-narratives, but never shaved my head or joined the skinheads. However, He did attend some meetings with Matthew Heimbach, a year or two older than Alex and the founder of the Traditionalist Workers' Party, whose mission statement is, quote, fighting for the rights and self-determination of whites in America. Heimbach was recruiting people for a big march in Charlottesville to protest the removal of a Confederate statue. Alex had plans to go, having been told it would be a peaceful protest. But then one of the organizers changed his stance and started talking about bringing guns. That was a bit too much for Alex, and the father of three, with another soon to arrive, decided to forego the event. At a Louisville rally, the burly and bearded Heimbach was arrested for shoving black student activist Kashia Nwanguma. The video went viral. Heimbach pleaded guilty to a lesser harassment charge to avoid jail time, but he remained committed to the cause. White Americans are getting fed up and they're learning that they must either push back or be pushed down, he said. Heimbach again made national news when he was arrested for assaulting both his wife and the co-founder of his Traditionalist Workers' Party. According to the Washington Post, Heimbach was accused of attacking his wife and choking his wife nationalist group's co-founder unconscious after the pair caught Heimbach having an affair in a trailer, authorities said. It was one of the year's more bizarre stories. Heimbach was having an affair with the wife of co-founder Matt Parrott, age 35. Parrott's wife wanted out, and they set up Heimbach to see if he would make an advance while Parrott documented it. They all lived in an Indiana trailer park, a communal move to advance their religious and political interests. So Parrott and Heimbach's wife stood on a box outside the trailer window, and Heimbach was caught propositioning Parrott's wife. However, the box broke, and Parrott, Heimbach, and Heimbach's wife found themselves in a physical altercation that led to Heimbach's arrest. But there's more, enough to make Jerry Springer proud. Parrott is the stepfather from a previous marriage of Heimbach's wife, making Parrott the father-in-law of sorts to Heimbach, and making Heimbach an adulterer of sorts with his mother-in-law. Vice News called it among the most incestuous, not to mention confusing, love triangles of all time. Before this situation, when Heimbach and friends arrived in Charlottesville, the crowd of people waving Confederate flags and a few swastika flags were confronted by angry progressives. Before officials could quell the growing riot, a self-identified white supremacist drove his car into the crowd and killed Heather Heyer and injured 40 more. Alex dodged a bullet by deciding to stay away. Alex, Bazian, and I hitched a ride to a village just below a monastery. We had plenty of time for conversation. Alex's Arabian Cush theory, which provides a way to push the Edenic Cush reference in Genesis from black Ethiopia to Abraham's lighter Middle East, is rooted in a verse in Habakkuk 3:7. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. King James Version. Midian is known as northern Arabia, where Moses stumbled into his father-in-law Jethro. Centuries earlier, Abraham also journeyed there. The area was named after his son Midian. Easton's Bible Dictionary says of this verse in Habakkuk, probably a poetic or prolonged name of the land of Cush, the Arabian Cush. So there is an Arabian Cush, but scholars generally conclude that most of the references to Cush in the Bible refer to the Cush south of Egypt, what the King James Version and the translators of the Greek Septuagint concluded was Ethiopia, the land of burnt faces, described by Homer. This view is supported by the fact that the Jews did not have a word in Hebrew for Cush, something they would have had were it from Arabic origin. Instead, the first instances come from Egypt. An artifact in a museum in Florence, Italy, the Buhin Stela, which dates to the reign of Pharaoh Seti I in the 13th century BC, refers to a region known as Kos or Cush. Other texts from the 16th to the 11th centuries BC refer to this region as KSH, without vowels. Easton's Bible Dictionary says the meaning of Cush causes not a little controversy, but then provides a seemingly fair and neutral assessment of the various views. Muller implies that a possible Black Adam is at the heart of the controversy. Easton's admits that the Hebrew term Cush generally applied to the southern limits of Egypt, Ethiopia, with which it is generally associated. The New Bible Dictionary agrees, concluding that Cushite is usually taken as Ethiopian. Muller makes a similar conclusion. Every time the land of Cush is mentioned in the Bible, which incidentally is 30 times, the primary interpretation of the southern neighbor of Egypt is far easier to make than the secondary interpretation of West Asian locations. Why prefer the Greek Septuagints and King James Bibles Ethiopia to the modern versions Cush? The answer harkens back to why traditional Christian churches like the Eastern Orthodox use the Greek Septuagint translation in the first place. Published in the 2nd century BC, scholars preferred it over the Hebrew manuscript used today by modern translations, the Masoretic text, published 1,200 years later in AD 950. Traditional translators saw the obvious. Scholars looking at a text 1,200 years earlier had better access to the meaning of the original text. They also trusted the handing down of manuscripts by Christians rather than Jewish rabbis with a bias against Christianity. Orthodox priest John Peck notes that many of the discrepancies between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Masoretic texts affect Old Testament messianic prophecies. Isaiah's "Behold, a virgin shall conceive" in the Septuagint becomes "the young woman is with child." The psalmist's "They pierced my hands and my feet" becomes "like a lion, my hands and my feet." For the proper rendering of the word Cush, the Septuagint Jewish scholars in the 2nd century BC, living at or near the time of these actual ancient lands, chose Ethiopia. They were confident that Cush referred to the great land Homer and the Greeks discussed, often with high praise. Almost all modern Bible translations, relying on the much later Hebrew manuscripts, use Cush for Ethiopia. The Revised Standard Version even calls Isaiah's virgin a young woman. However, the King James translators stuck with Ethiopia, as they also consulted the Septuagint and St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate in translating the Old Testament. All English translations before the King James Version also use Ethiopia, adding credence to the Eden-related verse of Genesis 2:13 as indeed alluding to today's Ethiopia. In fact, the testimony of the most ancient of historians, both Greeks and Egyptians, serves as some of the more persuasive evidence of an Ethiopian Eden. One of the most reliable ancient scribes, Diodorus Siculus, writes the following: "Now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men. And the proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest, for they did not come into their lands as immigrants from abroad, but were natives of it." He cites historians Agatharchides of Cnidus and Artemidorus of Ephesus. Just to drive home his point, Diodorus adds that knowledge of the Ethiopians as the first humans is conceded by practically all men. It is a pity that we do not have more manuscripts of the lost histories of ancient Ethiopia. An Egyptian captain named Philon toured Ethiopia in the 3rd century BC. We know that he described his entire journey in a book entitled Ethiopicus, but it has not survived. Another adventurer named Ariston also wrote a book. which is lost, as was the book of his successor, Bdellium, used as the source for Eratosthenes and other geographers. A century later, Bion, Aristocreon, and Simonides wrote books about Ethiopia, all of which are also lost today. However, Egyptian works do survive that discuss adventures into the land of Punt, described as southeast of Egypt, where Ethiopia sits. Punt is also called Ta Netcher, which means the land of God. In this ancient material, which describes Egyptian Queen Hatshepsut's commissioned expedition into the sacred country, the god Amun, the Egyptian Zeus, says the following: I gave you Punt in its entirety as far as the land of gods, God's land. Moreover, it is a place of my recreation. This land of the gods parallels what the Greeks say about Ethiopia. In the Iliad, Homer, the earliest Greek author, writes in the 800s BC, Zeus went yesterday to Oceanus, to the blameless Ethiopians, for a feast, and all the gods followed with him. Homer writes in the Odyssey, Poseidon had gone down among the far-off Ethiopians, the furthermost of men, some where Hyperion sets and some where he rises. Greek historian Herodotus makes a similar association. The inhabitants worship Zeus and Dionysius alone of the gods, holding them in great honor, thus backing, or nearly so, the Ethiopian claim of long-time monotheism. Diodorus notes that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, and the larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are they hold Ethiopian. Diodorus adds that Egyptian hieroglyphics came from Ethiopia and that the pharaoh's priests learned their sacred trade from them as well. Any speculation as to whether Punt, the land of Egypt's gods, the original land of God, was Ethiopia proper, was put to rest in 2010 when scientists used DNA technology to examine baboon genetic material in Egypt acquired from the Puntite civilization. The team studied the baboon mummies in the British Museum, wrote London's Independent. By analyzing hairs from these baboons using oxygen isotope analysis, they were able to work out where they originated. Although isotope values in baboons in Somalia, Yemen, and Mozambique did not match, those in Eritrea and Ethiopia were closely matched. What of the first river, the Pishon, mentioned in the Genesis passage just before the Nile and Ethiopia? Scholars have little to say about it. We only know that it winds through the entire land of Havilah where there is gold. If we believe it is near the second river, the Nile, and its source, Ethiopia, then Diodorus again is helpful, who says Ethiopia contains large gold mines where the gold is secured in great quantities. Where is Havilah? Again, a little is known. Genesis 10 tells us that Havilah is the son of Cush. Therefore, it is likely that the place names Havilah and Cush would be near each other. According to one Bible dictionary, the Adal region, located in East Africa, and its port city, Zeelah, is believed to take its name from Havilah. Other geographers note that Benjamin Tutelah, a 12th century Jewish traveler, claimed that the land of Havilah is confined by Abyssinia on the west. Local traditions near Ethiopia and the Gulf of Aden in the Red Sea also assert that Fura, a king of the Havilah Gadiri clan, ruled in East Africa. In fact, the section of the Red Sea between Ethiopia and Yemen, the Gulf of Aden, has been known to be associated with Eden. The online etymological dictionary says that Aden is derived ultimately from Akkadian Adinu plain, which some think also is the root of biblical Eden. A modern geography notes the following regarding a local legend about the town of Aden on the Red Sea coast. It states that Aden may be as old as human history itself. Some also believe that Cain and Abel are buried somewhere in the city. The medieval French rabbi Rashi identified the Pishon with the Nile, likely because of a belief that all 4 rivers of Eden were in that region of the world. The Jewish Heritage magazine identifies the Gihon and Pishon as the Blue and White Nile. Our car arrived at the foot of the small mountain ridge in our quest for the unplugged village. We walked up toward the entrance of the long path to the monastery. A dozen curious teenage boys accosted us along the way. We learned later that they had never seen a white man before. Bosnians said they were calling us Chinese. We looked over the valley and my heart sunk. There below us was a long row of towers with power lines. Asking a monk who was making his way back home, Bosnian learned that the power lines had been built only 2 weeks ago and served both the town below and the monastery on the mountain. Now what? The boys who had gathered around us overheard our conversation with the monk. Some of them were from a village called Gororo, which still did not have power. It could only be reached on foot an hour away. They told us their church had a service that evening. The 3 of us took counsel and decided to make the journey. We hadn't come all this way for nothing. The boys, in jeans and t-shirts, barefoot, led us along the rocky path as we dodged sheep and goats. The unplugged village of long-time Christianity awaited us. We stopped for coffee at a home along the path. A young mother with traditional dress and head covering lit the fire and began roasting coffee beans picked from a nearby tree. Alex had been doing his homework. Guillermo said the Gihon River trumps the others because it mentions a geographical area, Ethiopia, he said, as she lit incense, part of the ceremony. But the same passage says the Tigris River goes toward the east of Assyria. He sipped some coffee with satisfaction. Assyria was indeed an empire in the Middle East, and that would point to the view of a Mesopotamian Eden. I shared with him what Gert Miller says about that in his book. The actual word in the Hebrew is Ashur. The King James Version says Assyria. Newer translations like the NIV say Ashur. Muller acknowledges that, in this case, the primary interpretation for a mention of Ashur would be the area of that name in the Middle East. But he points to another Ashur in Cush that might also serve as the referent in Genesis 2. In this case, however, the place name Ashur is never mentioned in the Bible. The explanation revolves once again around the mirror image of geography and names, the Athens, Greece and Athens, Georgia conundrum, or Memphis, Tennessee and Memphis, Egypt. Muller contends that there was an Ashur in Cush. Why? Because so many of the early biblical Cushite names, such as Sheba and Dedan, were used again a few generations later in Arabia. Even though Ashur isn't mentioned in the early Genesis names, Muller believes he did exist in Cush, and the Ashur of Arabian Mesopotamian Assyria was yet another borrowed name. It's either another Cush closer to Ashur or another Ashur closer to Cush, writes Muller. He chooses the latter. So, if the Ashur of Genesis 2 is near Cush, and Havilah, where the Pishon River flows, is also near Cush, then where in the Cushite area are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers mentioned in Genesis 2? Muller's search begins with the actual Hebrew. Tigris in Hebrew is Habakkuk, and Euphrates in Hebrew is Parat. Both have etymologies, descriptions of word origins, that might describe a river. Josephus gave the meaning of Habakkuk as swift with narrowness. Abarim Publications says sharp, swift, sharp rapids. Muller identifies a river of that description in northern Ethiopia, the Tigray region. The Tekezi River, the very waterway we have mentioned throughout this book dividing Eritrea and Ethiopia, crossed several times by Italian and Ethiopian troops, is in places a swift river with rapids. The Tekezi River Whitewater Rafting Company serves tourists for just such an adventure. Oddly, Muller refuses to make any connection between the similarity of the words Tigris and Tigray. The meaning of Parat, Euphrates, is to bear fruit. Josephus defines it as dispersion or flower. Muller identifies a river further north in Eritrea for this stream. The Mareb River contains a delta with heavy silt, and this body of water is key to a very fertile area of land in the region. Certain ancient historians associate the Euphrates with Greater Ethiopia. There is a story that the Nile itself is the Euphrates, writes Greek historian Pausanias in the 2nd century A.D., which disappears into a marsh, rises again beyond Ethiopia, and becomes the Nile. Alex was not impressed with Muller's arguments. Meanwhile, during our coffee ceremony, which can take up to 2 hours, we had plenty of time for conversation. Bosnian shared his views for an Ethiopian Adam, and his belief that the ancient Ethiopian language of Ge'ez is actually where the Hebrew language is derived. He talked about Moses' Ethiopian wife and Melchizedek as Ethiopian. Is God an Ethiopian? Alex asked. Enoch walked with God, Bosnian said, without missing a beat, and he was Ethiopian. Neither looked at each other. They just made little quips as they drank coffee and watched the pretty mother with a baby on her back organize her coffee setup on the dirt courtyard. Has your family always been Christian? I asked her. Yes, she said, through Bosnian's translation. She told us that her family attends church every Sunday from midnight to 8 a.m., and also on feast days and for baptisms and funerals. I was told Ethiopians can cite 7 generations of ancestors on each side. When I asked her about that, she looked at her mother with an anxious laugh. She wasn't able to get to 7 generations. Was your family Jewish before they were Christians? I asked. We practiced Old Testament teachings, she said. We gave her 100 birr, a nice sum for a village mother, and proceeded on to the village of Gororo as it grew dark. They were celebrating the feast day of their church, named for the 3 Hebrew youths in the fiery furnace from Daniel 3, so the entire village was congregated around the building where we were headed. Bosnian assured the leaders that these 2 white men, the village's first ever, were Orthodox Christians. That's all they want to know. They don't care about the distinctions between Eastern and Ethiopian Orthodox, he said. They just want to know that you're not Catholic. We had purchased white prayer robes a couple of days earlier, so we were able to enter the sacred building, men only as the women listened from the outside, and began enjoying a several-hour visual and audio feast, non-digital, analog, and authentic. Colorful icons covered the walls. Vested young men everywhere sang with power, held prayer sticks, and rattled sister-like instruments. About every 15 minutes, the big drums were brought out, and an animated rhythm and dance episode commenced. Then they retreated to softer chants. We were crammed into a small space. Most of the circular building was reserved for the priests. We operated from a foyer-like semicircle. At 2 a.m., we exited into almost pitch darkness. As we did, I noticed something that distressed me, but I waited to tell Alex and Bosnian. For the moment, it was time for a feast. Hundreds of people sat down on logs outside the church building. They gave us a log of honor. A dozen village elders in orange robes and square hats spoke while we ate meat and gravy and drank traditional beer in huge cups that they kept filling to the brim. It's a compliment to make it overflow. I asked for an interview and spoke with a lay leader who wore an out-of-place baseball cap with his white prayer robe. Bosnian translated. "This church was burned down by the communists," he told us. "Most families lost more than one person." How old is this church? 5th century. Before that, no formal church, but places of prayer from the time of Christ. What about before Christianity? "We practiced Old Testament religion," he said, careful like the young mother not to say Jewish. "The Queen of Sheba was born nearby." Alex had eaten and drunk his fill and was rested. He was looking for a place to sleep. But I had not finished my purpose and was pressing forward toward my goal. I chose then to tell Alex and Bosnian what had bothered me when I exited the church building. At the top of the door was a single light bulb attached to a long cord. I learned that power had in fact come to the village that very day. For Alex, that was good enough. Bosnian was a flexible Ethiopian, and they don't fight small battles. But I was insistent. We had not yet found the unplugged village. Bosnian told me that there was one more village church, an hour further, by foot, a sister congregation with the same feast day, who was also worshiping through the night. Problem solved. The teenage boys were willing to lead us on the path, this one rockier and steeper, with dangerous cliffs below us, and, unlike the earlier hike that day, in the pitch dark. Alex bit his lip and followed. We headed to a light in the far distance, and hoped that it would be the village and church we sought that had never had power in its millennia of worshiping Jesus Christ. In my many walks and travels with Alex, I learned more about his spiritual trek, which I will detail in a bit, a journey where he gained more light on himself and other nations as he experienced Christ in the Orthodox liturgy. Using Genesis 2 to identify the Garden of Eden in Ethiopia faces two types of objections on a higher level than arguing river and place locations. Firstly, many object to the idea that geographical locations have any similarity to the original after Noah's flood rearranged the Earth's topography. This objection can be overcome by asking then why God through Moses even attempted to describe the location of Eden. If the rivers, Ethiopia, Asher, and other specific spots had no meaning, why include them? The implication, therefore, is that in Moses' day, the rivers and place names of Genesis 2 referred to rivers and countries known to Moses' generation. Secondly, some conclude that Genesis 2 describes a mystical paradise, a more ethereal and heavenly state, and that Eden does not refer to any particular spot on the earth. This would contradict the view of many church fathers. John Chrysostom, a giant of early church teachers, interprets Eden, like most fathers, as both symbolic and literal. Likening the rivers of Eden to the church altar and the Eucharist, he writes, "A fountain went up out of paradise, sending forth material rivers. From this table springs up a fountain which sends rivers spiritual." But directly refuting modern commentators who distrust the historicity of Genesis and prefer only a spiritual interpretation, Chrysostom writes, "Blessed Moses registered even the name of this place, Eden, so that those who love to speak empty words could not deceive simple listeners and say that paradise was not on earth but in heaven, and rave with similar mythologies." The Genesis 2 passage not only provides the rivers as evidence of an Ethiopian Eden, but it also mentions gold, which we have already shown was very prominent in ancient Abyssinia, and a hefty part of Sheba's gifts to Solomon. After gold, the passage lists bdellium, a bit of a mysterious substance. It is only mentioned in one other place in Scripture. Manna, the bread from heaven that the Israelites ate in the wilderness, is described as having the color of bdellium. Since we don't know what manna looked like, this description is not very helpful. The Septuagint translates bdellium as anthrax, a precious stone. The St. Pachomius Library translation of the Septuagint describes anthrax as a dark red gemstone, possibly a ruby or garnet. The highest quality of garnets in the world come from East Africa. The fourth of the 12 precious stones on the vestments of Israel's high priest was a red garnet, representing the fourth son, Judah, who corresponds with Aries, the first sign of the zodiac and the first month of the ancient new year, Mars March. Also fascinating but not really related is Muller's tidbit quoting a gemstone company. Noah, it is said, used a garnet lantern to help him steer his ark through the dark night. After gold and bdellium, the third substance listed in Genesis 2 is onyx. Though found in Ethiopia and in abundance in Africa, it does not add much to our discussion unless onyx, shoham in Hebrew, can be translated as malachite, which Muller attempts to do. But we will leave this discussion for another time. Malachite is, in fact, a particular commodity of Ethiopia. Also found in abundance in Ethiopia are the following items listed in the ancient Book of Jubilees, accepted by early Jewish scholars, which expands on Genesis. And on that day when Adam went forth from the garden, he offered as a sweet savor an offering, frankincense, galbanum, and stacte, and spices that were offered in the morning with the rising of the sun from the day he covered his shame. Jubilees 3:27. All of these plant-related items sacrificed by Adam point to an Ethiopian rather than a Middle Eastern Eden. The Book of Jubilees was written by Jewish scholars in the 2nd century BC. Though not part of the Jewish, Catholic, or Orthodox canon, it is considered reliable by many, quoted by several church fathers, and part of the Ethiopian Bible. The only full manuscripts are from Ethiopia, but several Dead Sea Scroll fragments confirm its reliability. Jubilees also provides directions to Eden from northern Africa, up the Nile to Ethiopia. The map starts at the Mediterranean Sea, then, quote, extends west to Afra till it reaches the waters of the river Gihon, to the banks of this river, and it extends towards the east till it reaches the Garden of Eden. Jubilees 8:15. Writes Muller, Jewish scholars of the 2nd century BC concluded, based on Genesis, that the Garden of Eden was located in East Africa. This can be concluded from reading the Book of Jubilees, he says. There was no reason for later scholars not to know about the real location. The Garden of Eden is the Holy of Holies, says Jubilees 8:19. This language is a direct allusion to Israel's Holy of Holies in the temple, where the ark was kept. The oldest written Eucharistic service of the Church, the Liturgy of St. James, calls the atrium of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem the, quote, Holy Garden, an allusion to Eden, but also a reminder that Jesus himself is evoking Eden and allowing himself to be confused with the gardener upon his resurrection. When Alex and I first discussed the Eden in Ethiopia theory with our professor friend, Germa, he brought up, curiously at the time, the fact that the Israelite kings were crowned in Jerusalem at the spring called Gihon. This tidbit made more sense as I learned that Solomon himself crowned at Gihon made a conscious effort, along with Moses and the rest of Israel, to model Jerusalem and the temple after the Garden of Eden. In Genesis, humans spoke directly with God when they were in the Garden of Eden, writes Muller. Building a temple was a way of reopening the direct line. The tabernacle and temple rises up to the Holy of Holies in a terrace-like form, similar to how ancient Punt modeled its temples after Ethiopia's terraced farmland. Egypt's Queen Hatshepsut considered Punt the, quote, land of God, to be the Holy of Holies, and called their Egyptian temple modeled after Punt the place of first things. The priests of Israel attached pomegranates to the hems of their robes, attached them to the top of the temple pillars, and wove them into temple curtains. The word pomegranate stems directly from garnet, and it is the only fruit represented in one of the few images in Solomon's temple design. A temple was essentially a mini Punt or a mini Garden of Eden, writes Muller. All deities were, therefore, of Ethiopian origin. The Jubilees map says the Gihon extends towards the east till it reaches the Garden of Eden. The Bible says the garden is, quote, in the east, and Greek writers referred to Ethiopians as people with burnt faces who were closest to the sun, which rises in the east. The etymology of Gihon is to burst forth. Muller thinks he's found the ultimate source of this Edenic river. The Gihon does indeed burst forth from a spring at Gish Abe near Lake Tana. Graham Hancock cites a scholar who calls a spring at Lake Tana Gihon. National Geographic reports on the people who live near this spring. The Gihon is yet another name for the Blue Nile, and one with strong biblical connotations. To the people in these villages set smack in the gorge, the Nile was one of the 4 rivers that flowed out of Eden at the beginning of the world. Alex and I were headed to a similar small Ethiopian village, this one without roads, so one must travel by foot. In the middle of the night, using iPhone flashlights, no cell coverage of course, we started to make our way up the giant hill where we could see faint lights from the church. We assumed they were not man-made. The liturgy of John Chrysostom, observed each Sunday by both Eastern Orthodox and Ethiopian Christians, had made an impact on Alex over time. It says God's salvation is for, quote, all peoples, and repeats over and over again 18 times that God loveth mankind. Each service ends with, for God is good, and he loveth mankind. Alex talked about John Chrysostom, the giant 4th century church father who composed commentaries on nearly the entire Bible, and though patriarch of the New Rome, Constantinople, ended his life in exile and poverty for denouncing the worldliness of the emperors. He was awesome, said Alex. He was a firebrand for saying, look, men of every tongue, tribe, and nation worship in this church, and that's the way it should be. He was real big on that. Alex heard the Beatitudes recited in every liturgy. This emphasis on humility affected him over time and softened his ethnic pride and nationalism. He still has some pride. Oh yes, this is where I come from. These are my desires, my likes and dislikes, based on my genetics and upbringing. But it's not a competition. It has to be put in its proper place, which is way down the list of priorities. Alex had not yet joined me in sharing enthusiasm for the Ethiopian Eden theory, but he was beginning to warm up to the Ethiopians, of which I will share more. He also had a later encounter back in the United States that is worth sharing. Matthew Heimbach, the poster child for white nationalism, who made the headlines of the Washington Post, moved to a town in the U.S. near Alex and began visiting his church. He recalled that Alex had attended some meetings a couple years back and told him he was so glad to find, quote, one of us at the church. Chapter 16. I entered the National Museum of Ethiopia. This institution is famous for its exhibit of Lucy, the 3.5-foot tall missing link half-ape, half-human set of bones found in Ethiopia, dated according to the museum's brochure at 3.2 million years old and celebrated at her discovery as the oldest human remains ever found. A large body of science agrees with the out-of-Africa theory for the geographical location of man's origins. But it also has its vocal opponents. The whole out-of-Africa myth has its roots in the mainstream academic campaign in the 1990s to remove the concept of race, says Australian historian Greg Jeffrey, cited by Stephen Strong in his article, DNA Evidence Debunks the Out-of-Africa Theory of Human Evolution. Jeffrey adds, when I did my degree, they all spent a lot of time on the out-of-Africa thing, but it's been completely disproved by genetics. We will look at the DNA evidence he references. Stephen Strong himself is an Australian who champions the idea that his Aboriginal peeps down under are actually the first humans. He makes some decent points, likely because the scientific consensus is that the second oldest migration is out of Australia. But strong, strident arguments demonstrate what a minefield this whole subject can become when racial agendas are in play. When I discussed the out-of-Africa theory with Alex, he pointed me to a scientific paper written by two Russians. Many Russians, of course, share Alex's Viking ancestry, and in fact, Strong cites these Russian authors in his refutation. A very recent paper on Y chromosomes, released in 2012 by Anatoly Klyasov and Igor Rozhansky, strongly supports the existence of a common ancestor who would not necessarily be in Africa. In fact, it was never proven that he lived in Africa. What's at stake here? Bragging rights for ethnic groups, of course, but also grant money and department funding for professors. A theory for European, Russian, or Siberian origins, they all exist, might be suspect for racist reasons. A theory promoting Africa might be reverse racism, a feel-good liberal agenda. I met the guide at the Lucy Museum, an elderly Ethiopian gentleman named Yosef, who has worked there for many years. We sat down for an interview. I asked him about the Ark of the Covenant. Is it in Ethiopia? He spoke softly and said he has concerns about the fact that the Ark is mentioned later in the Old Testament, 300 years after Sheba and Solomon's day. He changed the subject. He wanted to talk about ancient civilizations. The Egyptian gods came from here, he said, before history began, before the pharaohs. He mentioned Moses' wife as being Ethiopian, and definitely Melchizedek. Regarding Eden, he said that one of the rivers is Gihon. It is the Blue Nile. The Pishon is the White Nile. He talked about Cush being the son of Noah, adding the captain of the other ark to the list of famous Ethiopians. The founders of Ethiopia descended from Noah, I was told by the prominent scholar and monk when I visited the Abba-Garima monastery and asked advice on writing a history. That is important. Professor Girma was less adamant on the view of an Ethiopian Noah. Noah's Ark was in today's Turkey, I think, or Armenia. It is better to say Noah landed here for a certain period of time and one of his sons came to Ethiopia. So you are not saying Noah lived in Ethiopia? He did for a certain period of time. His student, Elias, was more open to an Ethiopian Noah. He said the location in Turkey is too arid, and an area like Lake Tana matches a watery flood narrative. Of greater importance, he noted that Ethiopia is a more strategic and central geographic spot for Noah's 3 sons to spread out across the world. But he wasn't advocating it as strongly as the Eden theory. I asked my museum guide, Yosef, about the Lucy exhibit. He changed the subject. I looked into Lucy. She sounds like a nice gal, but she has some real issues. Dr. Donald Johansen announced her discovery in 1974, and a tour of the bones, a skull with about 40% of her skeleton, was exhibited across America. Lucy became an overnight sensation. What we weren't told is that Johansen originally found what looked like a pile of scattered rocks and pieced them together to create his ape human. One of the knee joints was found 2 miles away, 70 meters deeper in the ground. One of the vertebrae was proven to belong to a baboon. 2 scientists in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology explained in scientific lingo that Lucy's bones are compatible with a significant degree of arboreal locomotion. In other words, Lucy lived in a tree. She was likely a monkey. It never helps in the arguments for this feminine missing link to learn how Lucy got her name. As Johansen and friends dug into the Ethiopian ground to get some bones, they were listening over and over again to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a song inspired from Countless Acid Trips by the Beatles. Fortunately for the out-of-Africa proponents, the theory is in no way dependent on Lucy. Before we get to genetics, the 2 scientific disciplines of paleontology and linguistics also point to an East African origin for humanity. The most diverse skulls on the planet hail from Ethiopia. The length of the long bones, shin to thigh bone, that scientists look for to indicate age also point paleontologists to an East African origin. Linguistics looks for the highest point of diversity to indicate age. And this brand of science concludes that the other races with less diversity would have stemmed from the original, most diverse culture. In fact, studies indicate that the most diverse area in terms of language is Africa. Phonology, a branch of linguistics, reaches the same conclusion. The original people would be expected to be the most complex, to have the most phonemes, the number of sounds in a group of languages. The least phonemes are found in the Americas, the furthest distance from the area with the most sounds, East Africa. Science made a leap in its ability to determine the age of cultures with the discovery and use of mitochondrial DNA. This DNA science has become a more definitive source of information about past population movements than the traditional tools of archaeology and linguistics, writes Harvard scientist David Reich. He credits the beginning of mitochondrial DNA studies with professors Alan Wilson and Rebecca Cann, who wrote a seminal 1987 paper, Mitochondrial DNA and Human Evolution. In a 1992 article in Scientific American, The Recent African Genesis of Humans, Wilson and McCann wrote that all humans today can be traced along maternal lines of descent to a woman who lived about 200,000 years ago, probably in Africa. Reich mentions the name she has come to be known by, Mitochondrial Eve. He notes that the lower genetic diversity of non-Africans compared to Africans reflects the reduced diversity of the modern human population that expanded out of Africa. Harvard's David Reich is one of the rising stars of DNA genome research, in part for his credentials, but also for being an excellent communicator. His online videos lucidly explain chromosomes, mutations, and exactly how scientists calculate the age of ancient bones. He has an agreeable, positive, and enthusiastic way about him. Mr. Rogers meets the science guy without the bow tie. Part of Reich's enthusiasm is his belief that we have only scratched the surface. We are on the cusp of an ancient DNA revolution, he declares. Mitochondrial DNA got only 1/200,000th of the genome, he says, while new ancient DNA techniques can extract the entire genome. The first 5 ancient human genomes were published in 2010, he writes. By August 2017, my laboratory alone had generated genome-wide data for more than 3,000 ancient samples. What have we learned from all this new data? I could not tell from one of Reich's 20-minute videos whether he was saying that the new research debunked the out-of-Africa theory or confirmed it. I watched it 3 different times and I still couldn't figure it out. Was this highly intelligible professor just not communicating well? Or was the obfuscation on purpose? David is an eloquent advocate of the new science, says John Novembre, a computational biologist who studies population genetics at the University of Chicago. But another colleague perhaps explained why David was not so eloquent on the out-of-Africa question. Reich's ancient DNA findings are absolutely sort of mind-blowing, says Barry Cunliffe, an archaeologist and professor emeritus at the University of Oxford. They are going to upset people, and that is part of the excitement of it. What was Reich's bottom line? All the excitement is over the fact that ancient human migrations were not as simple as we once thought. People didn't always live in the same place most of the time, with a large transplant on the rare occasion. They moved around a lot, similar to our age. What the study of ancient DNA has shown now is that the past was no less complicated than the present. Human populations have always turned over, he says. It is a story about how our interconnected human family was formed in myriad ways never imagined. So, the ancient DNA of Europeans includes Asians, Africans, early Americans, and even some Neanderthals, Reich explains. We are all in this together, seems to be the key point to his highly publicized book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, Ancient DNA and the New Science of the Human Past. Unlike in his videos, his book seemed much clearer regarding the out-of-Africa theory. What they found is that the deepest branch of the tree, he writes, is found today only in people of sub-Saharan African ancestry. This sounds like an endorsement, but the discerning reader must look more carefully. Reich is also squirrely in print. In fact, he refers to a deeper branch than what the mitochondrial DNA scientists found. His ancient DNA research is uncovering the deeper branch. Human beings today largely descend from a much later expansion from Africa, says Reich. He calls this later expansion a, quote, bottleneck event, where somehow the millions of people on the planet got bottled up in Africa, were reduced to just a few, and then suddenly left Africa again for non-African places. But this information does not mean that the earlier people in Africa before the bottleneck were always from Africa. It really is difficult to determine Reich's views on the out-of-Africa theory. The confusion, I suppose, allows him to get fans and support from both sides of the equation. The Financial Times decided he did stick with the now traditional scientific theory of African origins. Africa was the original cradle of humanity, are the words the Financial Times uses to represent Reich's views. But he never actually says that. And a thread on the topic 7 pages long at the Anthrogenica.com forum proves that such confusion remains. What Reich does say is that the new ancient DNA research shows that humanity shares a common ancestor in 2 places. The first occurs 1 million or more years ago, and he remains agnostic about the geographic location of this DNA atom. The second common ancestor, the one caught in a bottleneck, he identifies as definitely African, who, quote, occurs around 160,000 years ago, the date of mitochondrial Eve. Or maybe we should call him mitochondrial Noah. Reich provides another fun tidbit for non-Darwinian Ethiopians. Much of his book discusses new revelations related to his view that ancient mankind actually interbred with Neanderthals, the predecessors of our species, Homo sapiens. Neanderthals had 2/3 the brain size of Homo sapiens. When we tested diverse present-day human populations, we found Neanderthals to be equally close to Europeans, East Asians, and New Guineans, but closer to all non-Africans than to sub-Saharan Africans. In other words, Europeans have more ape-like Neanderthal genes than Ethiopians. We reach these conclusions however we analyze the data. This is the pattern that would be expected if Neanderthals had interbred with the ancestors of non-Africans but not Africans, Wright concludes. He then adds, the probability of these findings happening by chance was less than 1 in a quadrillion. Yosef, the guide at the National Museum of Ethiopia, had his own way of allowing Adam, Noah, and Lucy, metaphors for ancient archaeology and genetic theory, to work together for a common cause. Do you believe in evolution? I asked him. I have no answer about evolution versus creation. What do you think about Lucy? She's getting younger and younger. Other discoveries are coming in. There are many ways of coming into existence. What are your views about coming into existence? My interest is in those ancient civilizations that go along with the Old Testament. I like Lucy because we are getting much information on the Nile civilization. So you like the archaeology because it brings in resources. It's helpful for the development of our people. There is a big money fortune for us, whether we believe in it or not. A few months after our return to the U.S., Alex was shocked to see Matthew Heimbach and a few others from his community visit his Orthodox church. The white rights activist, the subject of a lead Washington Post story and a known national figure, had navigated his legal woes and was free to move on with his life. He and Alex caught up with each other, and in the account below given to me by Alex, Heimbach said that he was glad to see one of us at the church. After several long conversations where Alex shared with Heimbach his own spiritual journey past kinism and racial pride, Alex made his position clear. "I'm not one of you," he told Heimbach. Alex urged him to move past his previous activism stage and pursue true Christianity and its teachings like love your enemy, as promoted in the ancient church. On the following Sunday, Heimbach met at length with the church leadership. As he left, he said to Alex, "I've decided to follow your advice." Alex reports that Heimbach made the decision to disassociate himself from all ties to racially controversial organizations. Vice News reports similar comments. "I decisively failed at my original mission, which was to be a voice for working-class white folks," Heimbach said, "and ended up in the middle of the most humiliating white trash spectacle of the year. I'm just focusing on my responsibilities and duties to my family and God." For Alex himself, the Ethiopians made a difference in his views. They aren't all about technology and material progress and all that other stuff. They believe in the power of story and myth in a good way. Alex is still conservative, very traditional. He is the oldest of 9 children and has several himself already with no plans to prevent future blessings. He is unbending in confessing Christian beliefs and moral teachings, no matter how controversial or offensive to the modern mind. "I started to get their concern about giving in to a Western mentality," he told me. Then he read The Paradise of the Holy Fathers, a Synaxarion by Athanasius the Great, and realized how surreal the Eastern Orthodox stories could be. He was impressed by the Ethiopian commitment to believing crazy hagiography. Alex shared an example from Athanasius of a woman who was turned into a horse for not taking communion for 5 weeks in a row. She had to be doused with holy water to be restored. In another example, St. Anthony finds Paul of Thebes in the desert just before he dies. He laments having no shovel to bury the saintly father, but 2 lions appear, use their claws for the operation, and then leave the 2 saints in peace. Along the way, Anthony has a short chat with a satyr, a creature that is half man, half goat. So what happened when I went to Ethiopia, I felt like I fit in extremely well with them because our view of the world is actually very similar. They have a very pre-modern, still very ancient worldview. We have the same metaphysical basis for understanding the world and the same way of living, Alex said. For example, their women dress modestly, and they go to church regularly and so on. They have all this reverence and piety. Almost all my fellow white Americans, I can't talk to them about the same things I talk about with these guys. These guys get it. It's like, yeah, this is disgusting. This is degenerate. I can't believe this is happening in America. And they agree. I realize these guys have figured out what matters, and they agree with me. And I thought, these are actually the kind of people that I really wished lived in America. A donkey trotted past us and headed up the steep hill to the church of the Unplugged Village. Alex, Bozian, and I, along with a half-dozen teenage boys, trudged our way to the top. We reached our goal. This church and village, named Mole, has never known electricity. Candles lit the area, albeit with a couple of battery-charged floodlights. We took off our shoes and worshipped with them for an hour. Then we were asked to join the clergy in a separate outbuilding. One deacon cooked us mystery meat as we tried to catch a few minutes of sleep, but the outbuilding's floor was slanted, being part dirt and part sharp rocks. We were also given raw honey served out of jars with bare hands. Alex at first refused, but then chose the way of politeness. He was sick for the next few days. I interviewed the priest, Father John, who appeared to be about 40 years old. Bozian translated. "How did you get here?" he asked. "It's not easy, even for many Ethiopians." We agreed and thanked him. "Who is it that you worship?" I asked. "We worship the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." "For how long?" "For 2010 years. "Were you Jewish before that?" "Before becoming Christians, we sacrificed sheep to God the Father," Father John said. It was different than Jewish. We followed the order of Melchizedek and still do now, sacrificing bread and wine. Are you concerned about power coming to your village with ungodly messages coming from the TV and radio? No. With everything there is good and bad, he said, barely viewable in the dark cave-like building. Many here are fond of the lifestyle that is said to be in America, but everything comes with a price. He paused. So, we pray for you in America. Chapter 17. Mussolini's generals were under orders to exterminate all Ethiopians who were resisting the Italian invasion. As they continued with their executions and poisonous gassing, the exiled Ethiopian leader in England prayed by a small fireplace in a residential home, the only source of heat for a king who once reigned from a palace. Emperor Haile Selassie wrote to the League of Nations, now with a tone of desperation, "Dear members of the League, what kind of crime have we committed that led you to reject us?" He then asked a question that became a prediction. Does the League really want to discard the charter which justifies its very existence, and by doing so, commit suicide? At Christmas, during this dark period, the emperor gave one of his greatest speeches, broadcast by radio to his suffering Christian people in Ethiopia. There is no greater day of gratitude and joy for Christians than celebrating the birthday of our Savior, Jesus Christ. On this day of happiness, every Christian, by meditating on Christ's life and the work he accomplished for all of us, tends to forget the trials he faces and the sadness that breaks his heart. When he sacrificed himself at Golgotha for the atonement of our sins, he prayed with his last breath for the forgiveness of those who had tortured him, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Shame on those of us who are Christians and do not follow the way of the Savior of the world, whose life was filled with kindness, humility, and martyrdom. Since our childhood, our innermost thoughts have been overwhelmed by the mysterious, deep spirit of the divine infant's birth, which is not only expressive but also glorious and inscrutable. Likewise, no matter what one's reputation, whether one's accomplishment is great or humble, tiresome or fruitless, in the journey of life, the mystery of Bethlehem dominates our spirit. A year after this Christmas speech, two high-ranking officials sent a letter with an encouraging report that the people were standing resolute and strong because of two key factors. The first is the reputation of your majesty, which has captured the heart of the people. The second is the prophecy that has been told in every tribal language throughout the whole country that the enemy will not rule our country for more than 3 years. Due to General Rodolfo Graziani's ruthless campaign of atrocities, even the Ethiopians who had taken loyalist oaths to Italy were turning away and joining the insurgent guerrilla movement. These people now were convinced that the Italians intended to exterminate them, writes A.J. Barker in his book The Rape of Ethiopia, 1936. During Ethiopia's earlier counterinsurgency, the Duce's son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, returned to Rome to explain the difficult situation, but also to implore his father-in-law to seek better relations with Nazi Germany. At this time, the Italian currency was plummeting, and Britain, France, and the U.S. were all threatening significant sanctions. Mussolini followed Ciano's advice and met with the German ambassador. In this meeting, plans were made for Hitler to help Italy in a war against Britain. The Duce described the relationship as an axis around which all the European states could collaborate, and thus the Axis powers were named. Meanwhile, Mussolini would allow Hitler to invade European countries. Hitler first took over the Rhineland, that part of Germany seized by the Allies after World War I, Britain and its Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain looked the other way. Then, as so many feared, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and Austria to his immediate south. Again, the European nations did nothing, confirming Haile Selassie's prediction that the failure to protect member nation Ethiopia would lead to the League of Nations committing suicide. The Nazi aggression only further distanced Ethiopia from any hope of rescue. From here on, it was a short step for the League of Nations to more or less abandon Haile Selassie to his fate, concludes Barker. However, in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, an aggression that was the last straw for Britain and forced the Allies to act. Mussolini aligned himself with the Nazis. "Black shirts," he cried in a speech at Rome. "I have brought back from Germany and my conversations with the Führer a lasting impression. The friendship between our two countries, which we have consecrated in the formal political alliance of the Rome-Berlin axis, is now implanted in our hearts forever." The many years of appeasement had failed. Chamberlain was replaced with the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Italy entered the Second World War as an ally of Nazi Germany, writes Oswald. Overnight, Haile Selassie was transformed from a forgotten exile, languishing in a sleepy spa town in the West Country of England, into a key figure on the stage of world history. Soon after, he found himself a passenger on an aircraft flying to the Sudan. On a return trip to Ethiopia in 2017, I arranged to meet my friend, Professor Gihon Batu, the one I ate lunch with at the Lucy restaurant, and with reluctance shared my problem with believing in the Ethiopian Ark tradition. As I had told him, the Ark is referenced in the Old Testament 300 years after Solomon, making it difficult to believe it came to Ethiopia during the time of Solomon and Sheba's son. I struggled to find his office and the seminary where he teaches. GPS in Ethiopia is not always accurate. Beyond that, my cell phone did not work the entire time I was in the country. After an hour's delay, I headed to a coffee shop with Wi-Fi to get my directions using my laptop. That didn't work either. Stumped, I approached two Ethiopians next to me, shared my dilemma, and asked for help. I had Gihon's phone number, and so we were able to call and notify him of my whereabouts. I had no doubt that these two young men would exhibit the classic Ethiopian kindness. After sharing a few cups of indigenous Ethiopian coffee with Gihon, I brought up again my biblical problem. Directness is a character trait, for good or bad, that I picked up from my theologian father, who passed up his second calling as a football coach. Biblical dilemmas must be confronted. Gihon listened to me talk about how the scriptures record King Josiah ordering the ark to be brought out 300 years after it was supposedly brought to Ethiopia. He nodded his head and continued his usual pleasant expression. He was in no rush. After a long pause, he spoke. "Dean, have you read the passage in 2 Chronicles 35 about King Josiah?" "Yes." "Did you read the entire chapter?" "Yes, several times. It says they brought out the ark." "It says that Josiah asked them to bring out the ark. Does it ever say they actually did so?" I had to think about it. It wasn't a question I had thought about, not an angle I had considered. I went back to study the passage. He was right. King Josiah gives the order. The rest of the passage discusses all sorts of things that the priests do to restore temple worship, as the good king had commanded, in what is known as Josiah's reform. But it never says that they brought out the ark. The silence is deafening, especially considering that the ark is such a central piece in the rest of Scripture during those times when it is, in fact, actually around. Whenever it moves, there are great parades, processions, and convocations. The high point of King David's life, it can be argued, is when he dances before the Lord as the ark is being moved to Jerusalem. In those earlier stories, the movement of the ark is described in detail. By contrast, the book of 2 Chronicles drops the matter with no explanation. Guillermo was right. It made no sense for the ark to never be mentioned again. Josiah gave his command to bring out the ark in 622 BC. We know this date because the Bible says it was in the 18th year of the reign of Josiah. Only 4 years earlier, the prophet Jeremiah made a declaration that seems to fit with no ark actually appearing before Josiah during this period. In those days when your numbers have greatly increased in the land, declares the Lord, people will no longer say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. Jeremiah 3:16. Jeremiah shares these words after 300 years of biblical silence on the ark. The spirit of his declaration fits with the idea that the ark had been gone a long while and would remain gone. Given this major prophet's decree, it makes more sense that Josiah's priests did not bring out the ark, despite Josiah's desire to include it in his restoration. None of the details in the Bible of the Josiah reform make mention of the ark being taken into the temple. Only Josiah's request is recorded. Having successfully navigated this biblical problem, it now became necessary to focus on the challenge that Dr. Edward Ullendorf presented when he claimed that he saw the ark and that it was a medieval fake. He named the year as 1941, a time when the ark was held not in today's special chapel, but in the nearby St. Mary of Zion Cathedral. We do not know where specifically the Ethiopian church leaders stored the actual ark in the cathedral, but we do know that, as with all churches, St. Mary of Zion had a tabot, an ark replica, used by the priests in their closed-off Holy of Holies to prepare the Eucharist. This ark replica is brought out only on a few feast days. Could this be what Ullendorf claims to have seen? Scholar Sergiu Haile-Selassie recounts a 19th century episode of a priest from the Caucasus named Timotheos, who claimed to see the ark. According to Sergiu, Timotheos' description proves he was shown a fake ark. The church refused his initial demands to see it, causing him to appeal the matter to the emperor, who decreed his right to view it. During this time, it would have been possible for the guardian to substitute another ark and present it to Timotheos as the true ark, writes Sergiu. A Smithsonian Magazine reporter looked into the matter of who could view the ark, and in a 2007 article quoted the ark guardian on the policy. "No king or patriarch or bishop can ever see it, only me," he said. "This has been our tradition since Menelik brought the ark here more than 3,000 years ago." The reporter, Paul Raffaella, did his due diligence and interviewed the patriarch himself, Abuna Paulos I. "Can you believe that even though I'm head of the Ethiopian church, I'm still forbidden from seeing it?" he said with a shrug. "The guardian of the ark is the only person on earth who has that peerless honor." Given these first-hand quotes, it is difficult to believe that Ullendorf was allowed to see the actual ark. It was a replica. Ullendorf told the Los Angeles Times that he wasn't surprised that Graham Hancock, the author of The Sign and the Seal, was denied permission to see the ark. He called Hancock a parvenu, which admittedly I had to look up, a person of obscure origin who has gained wealth, influence, or celebrity. "You need to be able to speak their language, classical Ge'ez," Ullendorf said, regarding the credentials necessary to be an ark viewer. "You need to be able to show that you're serious." I have little doubt that Ullendorf believed with sincerity that he was allowed access, but his Ge'ez skills would never be enough street cred for him to surpass the patriarch himself in such privileges. Instead, our proper British professor seems to have convinced himself that he was part of the in crowd, like a visitor to an urban dance club who performs the white man's overbite in ignorant bliss. When Ullendorf's judgment is not clouded by that parvenu, Graham Hancock, he tends to express a number of views friendly to the Ethiopian ark theory. I quoted him earlier when he said it doesn't really matter whether the Queen of Sheba was from Ethiopia or Arabia, but he follows that comment by saying that the rich forests in Ethiopia favor Africa over Arabia, because the biblical passages reference much fine timber that she brought for Solomon's house and the temple. Ullendorf also points to a strong source cited by many ancient historians for an Ethiopian Sheba, the record of Josephus, the reputable first-century Jewish scholar. Josephus refers to Sheba as the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia. Ullendorf believes this is a reference to the ancient empire Nubia, also called Meroe, today's Khartoum in Sudan, where Ethiopia's Blue Nile meets the White Nile. Nubia Sudan borders Egypt and Ethiopia. Regarding Josephus's remark, Ullendorf says, even though this is probably intended to cover Nubia Meroe rather than Abyssinia proper, it does show a concentration on an African instead of an Arabian origin. Given the British professor's views, the Los Angeles Times reporter gives a curious critique of Hancock, stating that, in fact, biblical scholars consider Sheba to be Arabian, not African. Strange, because the primary biblical scholar the reporter interviews, Ullendorf, suggests the opposite. Girma provided me with some breathing room for a Nubian Queen of Sheba. He said that the Bible's use of Ethiopia, Cush in some translations, refers to a far larger area and empire than today. But any reference to Ethiopia in the Bible refers to today's Ethiopia, he insists. There is a church decision about that. But today's Ethiopia is very much narrower than the historical Ethiopia. He said that the Greeks and Homer referred to Ethiopia as the place from where the sun rises to where the sun sets. It's just to say Ethiopia is a big country. In other words, the Ethiopian Empire at one time included Nubia and the White Nile, as well as parts of Yemen across the Red Sea. Early church scholar Origen discusses the issue and refers to Homer's description of Ethiopia as the uttermost parts of the earth. Origen compares this phrase to Jesus' statement that the Queen of the South came from the uttermost parts of the earth to visit Solomon. Church fathers Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory the Theologian also subscribe to an Ethiopian Sheba. Not much of a groundswell of support exists for an Arabian Sheba. In Ethiopia, the tradition of the Queen of Sheba is much stronger than in South Arabia, writes Sergiu Haile Selassie. Let us not deny all the ancient traditions in Ethiopia if we are not able to put anything better in their place. My Aksumite guide, Yirga, took me to the traditional site of Sheba's palace. It is located beneath Makeda Mountain, the same name given for the queen in the Kibra Nagast. Among the ruins of the foundation near the center is an altar area. He said the deepest layer contains bone and charcoal that tested to 1000 BC by carbon dating. I never asked for a reference, but I always found his assertions reliable. Graham Hancock provides a differing account. He was taken to the same site in the 1980s by an employee with the Ministry of Culture, Berhane Meskel Zelalu, who told him proudly, according to Hancock, that he was looking at the Queen of Sheba's palace. Has any archaeology ever been done on the site to test the legend? Hancock asked. Yes. In the late 1960s, the Ethiopian Institute of Archaeology conducted some excavations here, Berhane said. And what was discovered? Berhane made a mournful face. The opinion was that the palace was not sufficiently old to have been the residence of the Queen of Sheba. Hancock wrote this account in 1992, but a report from Berlin in 2008 announced an update related to the archaeology finds. According to Fox News, Professor Helmut Zeigert of the Archaeological Institute of the University of Hamburg has been supervising a dig in Aksum, northern Ethiopia, since 1999. Working from the same Makeda Sheba location, the professor said, "From the dating, its position, and the details that we have found, I am sure that this is the palace." News outlet Nazareth.com provided more details. The university said scientists, led by Helmut Zeigert, had found remains of a 10th century BC palace at Aksum Dungur under the palace of a later Christian king. There was evidence the early palace had been torn down and realigned to the path of the star Sirius, Nazareth reported. The team said evidence for this included Sirius symbols at the site, the debris of sacrifices, and the alignment of sacred buildings to the rising point of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. Other facts point to an ancient Jewish presence in Ethiopia. Ohlendorf discusses the evidence of animal sacrifice in ancient Christian practice, who, for a period of time, continued this Old Testament ritual. Dr. Richard Hull of New York University says that Ethiopia's Falashas are the only Jews to continue to practice animal sacrifice centuries after Judaism stopped the practice following the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in AD 70. The Falashas themselves claim to have been in Ethiopia since 1300 BC. They are the last surviving practitioners of genuine First Temple Judaism, says Hancock. The Falashas are part of the Aga people. An 1820 account describes Jewish prayers recited by the Aga Falashas in a language no one could understand. The Christian Agas still practice Old Testament washing ceremonies. All Ethiopian Orthodox Christians retain a great number of Old Testament practices, including circumcision, kosher dietary laws, and both Saturday and Sunday Sabbaths. Aksumite archaeology extracts no pig bones. Marcus de Aude writes in the Liturgy of the Ethiopian Church, "It is unlikely that the Hebraic forms were anywhere more faithfully kept than in the Ethiopian service." On this point, Ohlendorf quotes an Eastern European Jew living in Addis Ababa. "I was simply overwhelmed at how Jewish everything was," he exclaimed. "What does it remind you of if not a Sabbath morning in an Orthodox synagogue? I found among the various Ethiopian amulets things very close to my own phylacteries and small scrolls. I was exhilarated to discover the high holy days also falling in September, the Sabbath being celebrated on Saturday, and time reckoned from sunset. The Ark parades in Ethiopia look like processions in the Old Testament," says Ohlendorf. "The singing, dancing, beating of staff or praying sticks, rattling of sistra, and sounding of other musical instruments remind one forcefully of the scene in 2 Samuel 6, where David and the people are dancing around the ark." Ohlendorf believes that the Bible passage in Zephaniah 3:10 points to an Ethiopian Jewish community in the 7th century BC. "From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering." New King James Version. Sergiu sees a similar date for a Ethiopian Jewish diaspora based on Isaiah 45:14. "The merchandise of Ethiopia will make supplication to you, saying, God is with you only." New Revised Standard Version. Also interesting is the dating of Ethiopia's favorite verse from Psalm 68:31. "Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands to God." King James Version. Traditional scholars believe that David wrote this psalm in 1045 BC. If so, the story of the Queen of Sheba turning to the one true God does take place soon, just a few years later. A preponderance of the evidence now seemed to point to an Ethiopian ark. However, another Bible verse confronted me. that jarred my ability to accept the Kebra story. And just to make it more complex, it all depends on how you define the term Bible. Chapter 18. On June 10th, 1940, Benito Mussolini made his announcement. Italy has entered the war as the ally of Germany. 3 days later, a Mr. Strong left the coast of England for Egypt in a Sunderland flying boat. Restoring the monarch in Ethiopia would put pressure on the Axis powers. Churchill wrote to his foreign minister, "I am strongly in favor of Haile Selassie entering Ethiopia." Mr. Strong, a.k.a. Haile Selassie, was headed to the Sudan to prepare for a return to Abyssinia with the help of Britain and the Allies. "Although France had been invaded by the Nazis," wrote the emperor, "we took the risk and flew over its skies to Malta." When the entourage reached Egypt, they rested for a time and walked to the Nile River. We were moved by deep feelings of nostalgia. In fact, we cupped our hands, scooped up some water, and sipped a little. In Sudan, the British demurred on any immediate action. Italy still had 300,000 troops and 200 planes in Ethiopia. Impatient, the emperor arranged for 10,000 leaflets to be airdropped. At the top was the verse from Psalm 68. "Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands to God." "I will sit on my throne once again," Haile Selassie assured the world. "This is the day God has willed." In a radio broadcast, he assured his people, "Your sacrifices have borne fruit. Your major weapon was your innate heroism, and your hope was the God of Ethiopia." To those Ethiopians still siding with the enemy, he said, "Hereafter, if you continue to be Italy's instrument, you will leave behind only infamy for your descendants." British commanders in Sudan continued to stall. Fortunes turned for Haile Selassie when Churchill dispatched to the scene a young major, Orde Wingate, a 37-year-old military star and Zionist idealist who had lived in a kibbutz in Israel. The aggressive officer dreamed of entering the liberated Ethiopian Jerusalem on a white horse. The gung-ho Zionist British major and the Ethiopian emperor hit it off right from the start, writes Osfawosen. In Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah, who could cite King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba in his lineage, Wingate had found his true lodestar, and from this moment on he was determined to do everything in his power to restore the emperor to his throne. When they first met, Wingate read a prepared statement. "Sire, in 1935, 52 nations let you and your country down. That act of aggression led to this war. It shall be the first to be avenged." He organized a resistance movement across the border near Lake Tana, at the source of the Blue Nile, a spot some believe to be the Garden of Eden. Wingate and the emperor then led a caravan of 18,000 camels that joined an eclectic group of 2,000 soldiers, Sudanese, Kenyans, Somalis, South Africans, and Nigerians, a foretaste of Haile Selassie's leadership a few years later on the continent. Wingate named this fighting expedition Gideon Force, after the Israelite warrior in the book of Judges. A British advisor described the journey. First Wingate, then the emperor on horseback, then, if you please, the high priest with his venerable beard gallantly paddling along on foot through the African bush with his black robes flapping and his prayer book in hand. Wingate and the emperor's small army joined forces with the soldiers gathered at Lake Tana and moved towards Addis Ababa as another British army, led by General Sir Alan Cunningham, marched to the capital from the south. The nation was aflame with the news that their emperor was returning. Again, the British delayed. Cunningham messaged Wingate to wait until the area was safer. Haile Selassie had waited long enough. and insisted the Gideon force move forward. We ought to do what our forefathers have done. We must return to our native country and die there. The prayers of Ethiopians everywhere were answered when Mussolini made his next move. The Italian army, now facing other confrontations in Europe, abandoned the capital to the delight of the people. The British were alarmed, however. Of the 100,000 people living in Addis Ababa, 40,000 were Italian civilians, and an uprising could involve violent reprisals. Haile Selassie returned to his capital city on May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years to the day that the Italian army entered. Tens of thousands cheered. The emperor rode in a convertible guarded by cavalry officers, and Wingate followed on his white horse. We could not control our tears and deep emotion, Haile Selassie said. We were welcomed by priests dancing to the tunes of religious hymns. We entered the church to express our gratitude to our Creator and stayed there until services were over. After a 21-gun salute, the emperor mounted the podium to address the crowd. No human lips can express the gratitude which I feel to the merciful God who has enabled me to stand in your midst on this day, he said, of which angels in heaven nor creatures on earth could neither have thought or known about. Mussolini tried to exterminate the Ethiopian race. The blood and bones of those who were killed with spades and pickaxes, of those who were split with axes and hammered to death, pierced with bayonets, clubbed and stoned, of those who were burned alive in their homes with their little children, of those who perished of hunger and thirst in prison, have been crying out for justice. People of my country, Ethiopia, today is a day in which Ethiopia is stretching out her hands to God in joy and thanksgiving. Let not our rejoicing be in any other way than in the Spirit of Christ. Do not return evil for evil. Do not indulge in the atrocities which the enemy has been practicing, he said. Take care not to spoil the good name of Ethiopia by acts which are worthy of the enemy. That day and thereafter the people listened to their Christian emperor. The British had misjudged the situation, and their fears of retribution and violence were unwarranted. Haile Selassie assured his people justice would come and called for them to join the Allied armies. As St. George killed the dragon, let us unite with our allies to stand against the godless and cruel dragon which has newly risen and is oppressing mankind. The dragon did indeed meet his fate. Confidence in Mussolini plummeted in Italy upon the news of his failure in Ethiopia. Later, the Allies' bombing of Rome left the people in search of food. The Duce was forced to summon the Grand Council, not called since the beginning of the world conflict, to regain the nation's confidence. The council cast a 19-8 no-confidence vote for the waning dictator. The Duce ignored it. The council also voted to restore the constitutional powers of the king. That afternoon, the two leaders met, as their regular weekly meeting was on the schedule. Mussolini headed to the royal palace of King Vittorio Emanuele III and began to explain what happened at the War Council. He was interrupted. "My dear Duce, it's no longer any good," the monarch told him. "Italy has gone to bits. You are the most hated man in Italy." As he left the palace, the king had him arrested. He was deposed and placed under house arrest. A few days later, a German commando unit of the Waffen-SS secretly flew into Rome, rescued the Duce, and set him up as puppet leader of German-controlled northern Italy. A tearful Mussolini said, "I knew my friend Adolf wouldn't desert me." He brought his current mistress from Rome, Cloretta Petacci, aged 20. The 60-year-old Duce met her in elite social circles. He summoned her prominent mother, Giuseppina, to his office and demanded, "Is your daughter pure? Keep her under surveillance. Whoever has the privilege of being close to Mussolini cannot have boyfriends." He later asked the mother's permission to be the young girl's lover. In an act symbolic of how an entire nation sold its soul for a season, she gave her approval. The idea that she will be near a man like you is very comforting to me. The mother then regularly invited Mussolini to spend nights at the family's 32-room mansion. She placed mirrors on the walls and ceilings of Cloretta's bedroom. The myth of Mussolini was still alive, although in reality he was bald, fat, short-sighted, and sickly, wrote Olah, who relays that the Duce liked to strangle women with a scarf. He also told Petacci that his entire life he could only be aroused by thinking of prostitutes. Soon, northern Italy was under invasion, and Mussolini and Cloretta fled to neutral Switzerland. According to journalist Christopher Stevens, Italian partisans stopped the truck in which Mussolini, disguised in a Luftwaffe uniform and clutching a suitcase of cash, was hidden under a pile of blankets. In the next truck, they found a terrified Cloretta. The pair were driven to the village of Mazzegra, where, on April 27, 1945, 2 days before Hitler committed suicide, the death sentence was quickly pronounced on them both. Accounts vary as to how they were shot and killed, some more romantic than others. Canestraro and Sullivan conclude that he was likely shot as he lay asleep. What we do know for certain is that both their bodies were found riddled with bullets about a mile from the village where they were taken. The next day they were moved to Milan and strung up by the ankles upside down on a rusty girder at an Esso gas station. Mussolini was 61. Cloretta was not wearing underwear when she died, writes Stevens. To preserve her decency, some of the older women in the crowd knotted her skirt between her legs before she was suspended like a slab of meat next to the body of her lover. Mussolini met the end he deserved. As narratives typically go, the character with opposite traits might be expected to meet a different fate. It was not to be. In fact, it can be argued that Haile Selassie's ending was worse than that of Italy's dictator. In the decades following Mussolini's death, Ethiopia continued to be attacked by Europe and the West, in a fashion even worse than the invasions of 1890 and 1935. But what could possibly be worse? At Adwa, Ethiopians repelled an attempt to conquer them. With Mussolini, Ethiopia survived an attempt to exterminate part or all of the population. Only one thing could possibly be worse than being conquered, worse than being murdered en masse. Today, Ethiopia has already experienced this worst thing to a great degree, and continues to be confronted by this spiritual and psychological force imposed from the West that seeks to destroy them. The demon's name is suicide. Two runners had taken sole possession of the lead in the final stretch of the 1960 Olympic marathon. The barefoot Ethiopian Ababi Bikila raced neck and neck with the soldier Radi bin Abdesalam, who wore 185 instead of his listed number of 26. But Bikila now knew his identity. He was the competitor to be most feared, according to Bikila's trainer, Ani Niskanen. Bikila fought with all his determination to keep up with the swift runner. The radio commentator captured the drama. Roddy was down as number 26, but for some reason he's wearing number 185, he noted. Roddy came from nowhere to win the International Cross-Country Championship earlier this year. Ababi Bikila, nearing a possible victory, wanted to please Emperor Haile Selassie. He had been quoted as saying, "My life belongs to His Imperial Majesty." Bikila served in Haile Selassie's imperial bodyguard, one of several thousand soldiers charged with protecting the capital of Addis Ababa. It was his intention to impress the emperor. Like Haile Selassie, He was a devoted Orthodox Christian, observed the feasts, fasted every Wednesday and Friday, and faithfully followed the traditions of his faith and nation. I wanted the world to know that my country, Ethiopia, has always won with determination and heroism, Bakila said. However, when he finally met the emperor in person prior to the 1960 games, the exchange was uncomfortable. He and the other marathon contestant, Ababi Wakjira, were brought to the emperor by the Ethiopian Olympic Committee chairman. Bakila had only recently been selected for the race after replacing the country's top runner, Wami Baratu, who broke his ankle in a soccer match. During one of the training runs, Bakila was timed breaking the world record, but no one took the results seriously. The emperor was no stranger to the Olympic Games. He first attended in Paris in 1924, the year Scotsman Eric Liddell won a gold for Great Britain as recounted in the Oscar-winning film Chariots of Fire. Decades later, Haile Selassie gained Ethiopia its own chance to compete in the Olympics. Their first opportunity was in 1956, 4 years previous to the 1960 Games. No one won a medal. The competitive emperor wanted a victory. Bakila's running partner, Wakjira, describes the first meeting in detail. The emperor asked who was who, and then he saw us. Both of us were very thin, and he said, "Who are they?" The chairman said we were the marathon runners, and he replied, "How can such thin people win?" The official responded by sharing Bakila's recent record-breaking time. "I didn't ask you for their times," Haile Selassie barked. "I asked you whether they could win or not." They flew to Rome the next day. Wakjira was asked if he was nervous about his first flight. No, he said, but he admitted that he and Bakila were nervous about the shoes. National pride was at stake, writes Bakila biographer Tim Judah. There now came the question of shoes. They generally did not run with shoes, but there was hovering in the background the question of national prestige. If they ran without shoes, it might seem as though the Ethiopians were too poor to afford them. Adidas, the shoe sponsor for the 1960 Olympic Games, had only a few pairs left when they arrived. Bakila's daughter says that they had to go buy some. He wore the new sneakers around for a few days before the competition started in order to break them in, she writes in her book, and his feet developed painful blisters. This naturally made him worry as to how he was going to go through 42 kilometers of race. No solution seemed to be in sight. He considered the matter at length, and there was only one thing to do: run barefoot. To his Swedish trainer Niskanen, who had promised victory for Ethiopia, the fact of Abeba's running barefoot only struck him as inviting defeat. As they neared the end of the marathon, Bakila looked down and saw that Roddy was wearing new white Adidas. They ran past the Circus Maximus on their left, in the direction of the balcony of the Piazza Venezia, where Benito Mussolini delivered so many of his famous speeches. The course then took a hard right, and they headed in the direction of the Termini train station, adjacent to the Piazza dei Cinquecento, which was named in honor of the 500 Italian soldiers killed by Ethiopian General Rasalula's troops in the Dogali massacre. However, before they would reach the train station, the finish line awaited them at the Arch of Constantine, built by the first Christian emperor of Rome, whose domain became officially Christian just a few years after Emperor Azena decreed Ethiopia the first Christian empire. Roddy had been a soldier in the French army. However, he was not running for France, even though in the past he had run under the French flag. He now represented Morocco, his native country, colonized by France, but having gained its independence only 4 years before. The two Africans, from the east and the west coasts of the great continent, served as a symbol for the future of the globe. They had both passed all of the European favorites, just as Africa was in the process of throwing off its colonial yoke. They also represented the growing continent of the future. Then he was racing for France, said the radio analyst, but now he's in the national colors of his native Morocco. Bakila, the African who's been right up there behind him for the last 10 kilometers, hasn't taken part in international events before. He gave his occupation as a private in the imperial bodyguard of His Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I. Well, the emperor can certainly be proud of his bodyguard today. Barefoot or not, he's managed to outpace some stiff competition. Only 1,000 meters remained. Either of these two finalists could win the gold medal at the 1960 Olympic Games. If the barefoot Ethiopian could find a way to finish first, he would accomplish perhaps the greatest feat in the history of all sports.